I thought it would be fun to give you guys a tour of our old barn today. Our barn has come a long way in the past 4 years, but before we go inside, we really should look back over some of the history I've learned about it, as well as how it was when we first started working on it. I knew that originally our property had several outbuildings, though only 2 remain, this barn and a small 1-stall garage building that we currently use as a chicken coop. But what I didn't realize until I did some more research was that the barn was actually originally twice the size that it is now. The current footprint is about 30 by 40, and after talking to some former owners, I learned that it was originally L-shaped. But the back portion fell down during a storm in the late 1990s. I was able to find some old aerial photos confirming this, and though it's a huge bummer, of course, I'm thankful that the owners at the time chose to keep the remainder of the barn up versus just having it all taken down. Learning this detail helped us understand why the roof at the back portion was patched in the way it was. Clearly, it was where the back of the L kind of overlapped. This style barn is typically called a bank barn because they're built into a bank or a hillside and accessible from ground level from both the basement at the bottom of the hill and also the main level at the top of the hill. They are a pretty common style barn here in Michigan. Most people with this style of barn traditionally had dairy cows, which would be milked in the lower portion, and then hay would be stored in the upper portion. I know that there was a hayloft in the remaining structure based on some old openings that were patched in where an elevator could feed through, and also the layout of the doors on the main level are pretty typical for where they would have pulled a wagon in from one side to unload, and then they could pull straight out the other side when they were done. Honestly though, I'm not convinced that they had dairy cows here. I have seen a lot of old barn basements with their head gates and gutter systems, and ours doesn't have anything like that. Of course, it could have been set up like that in the other half of the barn that no longer remains, but unfortunately, I don't have any pictures or information on the layout of that portion. Another detail I haven't been able to figure out is the year the barn was built. Sometimes you will see a date carved out in the wood or stones, and I have seen a few initials, but that is about it. Our property was farmed by the original family from the early 1900s until about the 60s. It was then sold to a larger farm in the area, mainly for the property surrounding it, and the house and outbuildings were primarily neglected for several decades. In the 1990s, a family purchased the house with 5 acres of the original 300, but the house at that point was condemned and unlivable. They spent 5 years restoring it, adding on the garage, and making it a home again. But the barn still sat. And I believe it was usable enough to house horses during that time, but I don't know what kind of condition it was really in. When we bought the property in 2019, you could barely see the barn. There were massive trees growing into the foundation, vines covering every side, and the area surrounding it was all overgrown. Besides a few chickens, I do not think that there had been animals in it or around it for almost 20 years. We knew the days were numbered for this building, and if we didn't step in quick, it would inevitably succumb to its neglect. The first major issue threatening the barn were the holes in the roof. The entire structure is made of massive, hand-hewn beams. The main supports measure well over a foot wide, and they were completely rotting through in multiple places. After we cleared out the overgrowth on the outside, we knew we needed to prioritize stopping the water damage. We needed to get a new roof. And while we are normally do-it-yourself types, a project this big was way out of our level of comfort. We didn't have the knowledge or the equipment, and we happily paid someone to come and put a new metal roof on. It cost us $7,500, and the man we hired was 70 years old. He worked by himself with a bucket truck for 3 days to get it done. One of the days he was here, he confessed to us that it was his 50th wedding anniversary. But he said he was going to take his wife to dinner later when he got home. Once the new roof was finished, we were approaching winter setting in. My husband Tommy started patching in some of the missing board and batten on the exterior, and we really wanted to start getting paint on the raw, worn siding. We were able to get about 75% of that done before winter came. We chose to paint with a brush versus a sprayer, both because a brush allowed us to lay the paint on thicker and because we were working on ladders pretty high up, so it would have been hard to keep a sprayer continually fed. I think we went through 3 5-gallon buckets of paint, and they were about $150 each. Spring of 2020, we worked on starting to clear the interior of the barn, specifically the basement, which housed decades worth of old hay, trash, and even a pretty decent canoe that we actually use at my parents' lake now. We also had gutters installed to help divert water away from the base of the foundation now that it wasn't going through the roof into the main level of the barn. And then we needed to work on replacing those rotted main beams. This may not surprise you, but buying replacement beams of this size is not cheap. We compromised this aspect of our preservation efforts by using free old power poles instead and shimmed it up when necessary. All of this damage was on the east side of the barn, and unfortunately, though we had hoped to preserve most of the original floorboards, we found there wasn't much worth saving. It would be better and safer to just put an entire new floor that was smooth and level with each other versus patching things in. We kept what boards could still be used though for something else and had our new pine boards milled by local Amish. Tommy and our oldest 2 boys hand nailed every single one in. By this point, we had added a milk cow to our homestead, and though I had cleared a little spot for her in the basement of the barn for milking and a little winter shelter, I didn't love the idea of walking up and down the hill with my buckets in the middle of winter. So we added an actual staircase in the barn. Previously, the only way to access the basement from the inside was through a little hatch and down a makeshift ladder. We also had power run to the barn so that we could install a few lights and outlets for heating the water trough. The following year, we also added a frost-free spigot to the basement of the barn, and that gets us to about where we are now. Though the list of things we'd like to do is still long, we spent the last year investing in other parts of infrastructure on our property. For the most part, the main level of the barn is storage for our winter hay, building materials, and various gardening things. It's kind of a catch-all as our really only outbuilding, and honestly, it's a bit of an area of shame, and there's bird poop everywhere. The basement is less embarrassing. We built out 1 stall that we typically use for winter pig housing, and then we also have an area for the milk cows to get shelter in the winter too. During the summertime, it's basically empty except for at milking time. We recently built out a new head stanchion area so that I can have multiple girls in at once. The way that the basement is laid out, having the only open end be kind of the narrower one, there's kind of a lot of wasted space that we haven't really found a way to need or utilize. We do store straw for bedding over here in the wintertime, as well as feed for our cows, but that's about it. We still would like to finish painting the final portion of the exterior. It's just a matter of budgeting for renting the right equipment to do it. We also really need to remortar a lot of the stone foundation and replace more of the floorboards on the west side of the main floor where it has been patched in. We also have plans for a lean-to, filling in a hole that used to drop feed from a silo to the basement, and some more upgrades for our gutters for rain catchment. But that's where the barn is for now. If you liked hearing some of the history and seeing our progress, let me know in the comments, and I'll be sure to do some other videos about our property in the future.